Tell me when. Hi, this is George Gruhn at Gruhn Guitars, and here for another weekly question and answer session. Gruhn Guitars is now in its third week of being open by appointment, and we also have the ability to take some walk-ins. So if somebody shows up with no appointment, what rings the doorbell, we can either get to them right away or usually within a few minutes. So we are open. We do request that people show up with face masks. If they don't have a face mask, we can set them up with one, but we are still carefully practicing sanitation and social spacing so that we can keep everybody healthy and productive. But I'll now plow into the questions that have come in over the past week and this morning. From Ken Dockery. When I was a kid, I had a 62 or 63 Gretsch Princess. Our home was burglarized shortly after I got it, so I never really got to play it. I'm now sentimentally thinking of searching out another. Is it something worth looking for from a playing standpoint? Well, the Princess was basically a different color variation of the Gretsch Corvette model, solid body. They came in a variety of body and pickguard colors, white and grape, white and gold, pink and white, as far as pickguard colors. But so far as if I personally were playing a solid body guitar of that time period, I'd much rather have either a Gibson or a Fender. And so we can think of numerous other models, but Gretsch's best guitars of the 60s that they're really noted for are hollow body electrics, like the Chet Atkins models. The Corvette model and the Princess had the single coil high Lotron pickup, which is, frankly, in my opinion, not as good as the P90 pickups that Gibson used, single coil. And their bridge design in general just wasn't as good. So I think that the Princess is an interesting model, visually great for videos, but I wouldn't go out of my way looking for one. Gregory Rolfe, I have an old Luxor 4-string instrument that I believe is a ukulele. Are you familiar with them? I have seen some of these that were ukulele banjos with ukulele type neck and a banjo, small banjo style body. They were very cheap student model instruments, which would be interesting decorator pieces as wall hangers. But are they valuable? Basically, the one-word answer is no. Scott Richardson, what is your opinion on roller bridges versus more conventional bridges, such as a knife blade or Strat-style bridges? Well, there's a variety of types of roller bridges. Gretsch had some, and other companies have some that go well with vibrato type tailpieces in terms of reducing the friction that would be taking place with strings during use of tremolo. But I can't give you a straightforward answer on my opinion of all of them, since there's some number of different designs, different manufacturers, some being better than others. So I will simply say that on some that are designed specifically for vibrato tailpieces, that it does reduce string wear and friction. It's not necessarily better for tone. But beyond that, each model, each manufacturer is different, and I can't really say much beyond that. Jack Frost, I have a Kalamazoo KG11 that I got in a trade, along with a 1943 Banner LG2. I really like the Kalamazoo, great tone, sustain, and resonance. I know these were one of the budget brands. What is your opinion of this Kalamazoo model? This was the least expensive of the Kalamazoo flat top acoustic guitars made by Gibson in the 30s through very early 40s. They had a rather short, squatty body shape, and their spruce top with just ladder bracing, straight transverse bracing, no adjustable truss rod, uh, mahogany neck, back, and sides, and they were very inexpensive when new, listing at under $10, which of course at that time a dollar book. Today, but still, I find it interesting that you feel that it has such great tone, resonance, and sustain, but in general, I would say it's not equivalent to the Gibson models and nowhere near as good as having a Gibson L of the same age. Most of the KG11s need work, such as neck set or other problems. Structurally, they're simply not as well made as the standard Gibson brand, even though they were made by Gibson. If you have one that is set up well and it plays well, it'll give you a good blues type sound. It's not as rich and full a sound as you get out of a L that was Gibson's least expensive flat top model of the 30s with the Gibson brand. The L also would have an adjustable truss rod, which the KG11 does not. But if you get a KG11 that needs a neck set, bridge reglue, and other work, you could end up with work that costs fully as much as the guitar is worth or more. But in general, the KG11, in my opinion, is not as good at sounding or as playability as a Gibson brand model. Tim Langdik in the Netherlands. I have an Epiphone Howard Roberts from '69. Do you know information about this guitar, since it is quite hard to find info on this guitar? How many were made? Mine has a frequencator tailpiece. Was that normal, or do I have a custom order? There were two model Howard Roberts Epiphones made by Gibson in the Gibson factory. The Howard Roberts Standard was made from starting in '64 and discontinued early in 1970. The Howard Roberts Custom with more fancy ornamentation was made from '65 and discontinued early in 1970. The Standard and the Custom both featured a body size, the same shape and size as an ES 175, 16 inches wide, arched top, arched back, but they had an oval sound hole and a standard arch top guitar type bridge. The Standard had a spruce top in the Epiphone model and actually had a fairly semi-decent jazz acoustic sound as well as electric, but it did have a floating pickup at the end of the fingerboard and had tone and volume knobs right installed through the top. And it typically had a tailpiece, same as on an ES 175. Howard Roberts Custom had more fancy vine style inlay on the peg head, more fancy fingerboard inlay, and had more elaborate bindings, multiple bindings on the body edges, but still had the spruce top and the arch top and back, and a floating pickup. There also were Howard Roberts model Gibsons made during the '70s of the same size and shape, but they were with laminate maple tops as well as laminate maple back and sides, whereas the Epiphone models had laminate back, but solid carved spruce top. And it had more acoustic sound. They're good guitars. The frequencator tailpiece was not standard for this model. If there are no other screw holes in the butt end of the guitar, take the tailpiece off and look, and you can see easily enough, are there or are there not any other screw holes? If there are no other screw holes and somebody just ordered one with a frequencator tailpiece, but otherwise, if you see other screw holes, it probably originally had a tailpiece that was very similar in design to the ES 175 tailpiece, although it had a little insert in the middle that had the Howard Roberts name on it. Greg McAdoo. George, many thanks for the webinar. Martin has moved away from the 1 11/16 net width. Do you have opinions on this decision? Does Martin ever seek your advice when making decisions such as this? I think I commented on this last week, but I'll say it again. As of just this past year, Martin has gone to 1 3/4 as a standard nut width, whereas prior to that, from after the first quarter of 1939, they went to 1 11/16, and that had been pretty standard on almost all the Martin models until very recently. But 1 3/4, if it has a comfortable, fairly low depth, shallow profile, but a more C-shaped neck contour rather than a more D shape in cross section, is actually very comfortable, conforms extremely well to the anatomy of the human hand. I personally prefer it, and I think it was a good decision for Martin to do that. And right now, none of their standard models made in the US have a 1 11/16. They are on the 1 3/4, which I think was a good choice. Dana Duplan, I have a rare variant of a Gibson L 00 in 1933 with a maple body and elevated fretboard. Curious about how rare the maple bodies are, and also why Gibson moved away from the elevated board. I really feel that it adds considerably to the tone of my guitar. First, it appears that what you have is not an L 00, but probably an L1 model. If it has 13 frets clear of the body, it would have been made around 1932. And if it has 14 frets clear, it'd be 33 through early 34. The maple body was not standard, but they did some in the L1s with maple. I've never seen a maple L00, and I've never seen an L00 with a raised fingerboard. But the raised fingerboard is similar to the design on an archtop guitar. And some of those guitars had a archtop guitar type movable bridge, and some others had a standard type flat top bridge. In terms of improving the sound, in my opinion, it doesn't. Frankly, I would prefer personally to have one that had the standard fingerboard glued on the top on a flat top guitar. I don't say the guitar you have doesn't sound good, but I have a feeling that if it didn't have the elevated board and is otherwise the same, it would sound every bit as good or better. Linda Carrar, back to the rewinding of pickups. If a vintage pickup fails, is it okay to replace it with a similar modern pickup and to just keep the failed pickup in the case or another safe storage place rather than to rewind a vintage pickup? And the answer to that question, I think, is quite simple. It's perfectly okay to do that as long as you're replacing it with a unit that interchanges so you don't have to drill or route any new holes. You don't want to enlarge the hole for the pickup, like putting a humbucking pickup in place of a single coil. And you want to have a pickup that is fully interchangeable, because to rewind the pickup, you're going to have to undo the solder joint and take the pickup out. If you take the pickup that has failed out and put it in a safe storage place, and you then put in a modern replica pickup, your value of the guitar hasn't been reduced. It may not be especially enhanced, but it's now usable. If you have a pickup that you like and it's interchangeable and you've done nothing other than unscrew the old one, undo the solder joint, install the new one, and solder it in properly at the connection, you've done absolutely no violence to the guitar. You have to do the same basic operation. If you're rewinding a pickup, if you would rather keep your vintage original pickup unaltered but not actually usable, you haven't heard anything. That pickup could always be rewound later if you ever change your mind. But you're doing no harm to do as you suggest. And the value of the guitar will not be reduced. It won't be brought back to what it would be if it had a perfectly functioning original pickup, but the value won't be especially much different than if you had an original pickup that had been rewound. You still got the other original pickup, it's untouched, and it could always be rewound later if somebody wants to. Stephen Chrysophylle, since many C and F model Martin archtops have been converted to flat tops, do you feel that the original unaltered models will increase in value since far fewer exist? In Newport Beach, California. The C model archtops were the same size and shape as the Martin O models, and the F model was 16 inches wide versus 15 for the C, and had an arched carved top. A lot of these have been converted to flat top. It's really not that easy a conversion. In fact, some folks who do this type conversion put a new neck as well as a new top, because the C and the F models had a 24.9 inch scale, and some players like a 25.4 scale. And if they insist on that, then they end up with a new neck and a new top, and then you end up having to rebind the top, and you're going to have to, you end up doing an awful lot of work. The neck set angle on the C and the F model is a very steep angle, because basically these guitars were built just like a flat top guitar, except that the arch top and the arch top type bridge adds quite a bit of height. So you have to have a very steep neck set angle, such that if you set the guitar flat on the floor, it will rest at the tip end of the body and at the tip end of the peg head, and the rest is completely arched off the floor or the table, not even touching. So you have to cut a heck of a lot of wood off the heel to really get a good proper neck set angle using the original neck. So you have to do quite a bit of work there. So you may end up with a neck that's not quite 14 frets clear at the body joint. So frankly, my own suggestion is you should leave them alone, because if you're good enough to do a really, really good conversion, you're probably good enough to make a good guitar from scratch. And it's true that these things are now becoming quite rare, and frankly, the value of an original in good condition, I think, is worth more than the value of one that is, once you take the top off, its value is down. And again, it's not good. When you convert it to flat top, it's not worth as much as an original flat top of the same size. So you still have a guitar. It's going to be a good guitar, but it's going to be a compromise. It's not going to have the value of a fully original guitar. I think you're better off to have somebody make you a nice new guitar, and that somebody could just as well be Martin, since new Martin custom shop guitars in particular, as well as their standard model guitars, are extremely good, better than they were making 50 or even 60 years ago. Not better than they were making in the 30s, but if you take that C model or F model and convert it, it's probably not going to be quite the sound either of a original model Martin made as a flat top in the 30s. So my advice is to leave them alone and let collectors or others enjoy them as they were made. Keith Gogan, I have what I think is a 1959 ES-125T. Is there any way to date Gibson models that don't have serial numbers? And the answer to your question is, while that guitar doesn't have a serial number, if you look through the treble side F hole, usually a bit diagonally and upward slightly toward the neck, you'll see inside near the edge of the body, usually is stamped a factory work order number. Gibson's work order number system started with the letter Z in 1952 and then worked backward through the alphabet. So Y is 53 and onward. And this should date the guitar, because those guitars, if they don't have a serial number on the back of the peg head, and they didn't start putting numbers on the back of the peg head on the hollow body models until early 1961, then you look inside through the treble side F hole and look for the factory work order number, and you can date the guitar from that. For also same person, I also have a question about another older guitar I have. I picked up a 1961 Silvertone U1 that plays and sounds great. The body has been refinished and relicked. Whoever did it did a really good job, and since it plays and sounds so good, I'm not really worried about that, but I'm curious how much a refinish may have impacted the value of this not all that expensive to start with guitar. Well, it's true that on that guitar, if it's refinished, it's not going to have as big an impact as if you refinished a pre-World War II Martin, in which case on the Martin, you'd probably cut its value in half or even more. On this one, you might have decreased its value by refinishing. Well, again, if you refinished it because somebody had already refinished it badly, you've increased its value by refinishing it properly. And if it was normal moderate wear, you've probably decreased its value by maybe 1/3 to 1/4. Because most of the people who buy this would probably be buying it as a utility guitar rather than a collectible one. But if you get into something like a Fender Broadcaster and you refinish that, its value is a small fraction of what it would have been otherwise. Because especially if you take the Broadcaster decal off, and you just can't hardly even tell what you had when it started. So in this case, you haven't impacted it too terribly much. William Clark, what is the tone difference between a F5 Lloyd Loar mandolin Gibson equipped with a Vierzy tone producer versus one without the Vierzy? Well, the Loar signed F5, so it was made from 1922 through December of 24. The ones with the Vierzy typically were in 1924. And Vierzy is a little wood disc with two little F holes cut in it, and it's suspended from the top bracing. And Lloyd Loar himself endorsed the Vierzys. He felt that it produced a better tone for playing classical. And in my experience, some of the ones with the Vierzy have a beautiful bell-like treble tone in the upper registers, which is really great for classical or for jazz, but they don't have that deep, dark sound that a lot of the bluegrassers like, and they don't have that powerful bark for the chords, for playing chord rhythm, which classical players never did. The bluegrass players uniformly tend to prefer the ones that do not have the Vierzy tone producer. And if you want that Bill Monroe type bluegrass sound or that bark chord sound where it really blasts it out, the Vierzy is not the way to go. Scott Richardson, same question about roller bridges, so that one's covered already. Robert Jarrett, was Maybelle Carter's 1929 L5 one of the first L5s with a modern neck profile instead of the original baseball bat necks? Can you also talk about the types of modifications that you know were done to her guitar, refinishes, parts, etc.? 1929 is when hers was made. And that's with modern knowledge that we have now regarding Gibson serial numbers and factory work order numbers. Are access to much better records than we had some years ago. But hers was definitely made in 29. And I actually had that guitar for a while on consignment. It's now in the Country Music Hall of Fame. It does have a relatively modern type neck profile, very similar to a Les Paul. And I have in my personal collection another one that is a serial number just a few away from hers that has the same type neck profile. Hers originally had banjo tuners on it, as does mine. And that was a feature done only for a few months in 29. The early 29 models still have a much larger, more triangular neck profile and cross section, much deeper, thicker neck, and they have 3 on a plate tuners. Maybelle's was something that she used very consistently from the time she got it in 1929 until she died. It was her main guitar. And over the years, one of the first things she did was change the tuners uh, to more standard right angle pegs, which were not available when she got it, but were available a year later. And so it promptly got changed to having the right angle tuners. And about the same time, Gibson had come out with a somewhat longer pick guard for L5 models, and he had the new longer type pick guard put on it. It was a typical 1930 through 34 type pick guard, and that's the pick guard that stayed on it for the rest of her life. But also over the course of time, she had changed the tuners at least a second time, so that by the time she died, it had later tuners. So it was its third set of tuners, and it had a different tailpiece. So it was on at least its second tailpiece, and it had been refinished. It still sounded great and played great, but from a collector's point of view, it was valuable because it was hers, more so than because it was just a good utility guitar or a great collectible in pristine condition. The one I have in my personal collection is very pristine, and hers certainly was used a lot, but it sounded really good. It suited her playing. There's a lot of people who think you just can't play country music on an archtop guitar, and it certainly worked well for her. So far as I'm concerned, they'd be wrong. And I think that my L5 is a wonderful guitar. It's one of my absolute favorite guitars. So I think Maybelle had good taste in guitars, although I suspect that the reason she got an L5 was not that she had a great opportunity to play one and then decided she had to have one too, but they'd gotten their first big royalty check. And what they did is they picked the most expensive guitar in the Gibson catalog, and they ordered one. And that's what it was. And it turned out that it suited her very, very well. For Robert Valacourse, thoughts on Gibson Southern Jumbos. I have a 2018. How do they stack up against the older Gibsons? The answer there is that the brand new ones are way better than what Gibson made in the 70s, and they're actually pretty darn good guitars. Are they better than the ones from the early 60s and from the 50s? In my opinion, no. I'd rather have the old original one. However, the new one can be had for less and is still a pretty darn good guitar. It's absolutely suitable for stage use or studio use, or certainly for a good amateur player or even for a professional player. Gibson is making some respectable flat top guitars these days. Do I think that the new SJ, though, is as good as getting a 1952? No, but it's still a plenty respectable guitar. Onward to questions. Mel Chapman. I have a 2020 Gibson Les Paul Special Tribute. It has a non-adjustable bridge. However, it is a compensated unit. I'm considering a replacement one-piece tunematic bridge. It also doubles as a stop bar. Intonation of the existing bridge is marginal on the E, B, and G strings. Would you recommend a replacement for me? Well, if the intonation is marginal and is non-adjustable, several options. One, the Joe Glazer in Nashville makes a non-adjustable for intonation, but he makes one that's very well intonated that would fit on that. There's a number of makers that do tunematic adjustable bridges that fit right on the stop bar mount. And I'm not going to try to get into endorsing one versus the other. They all will intonate quite well. I think Tone Pros has a model that will work on that, but and PRS has on their Cardi models has a bridge that will, I think, fit on the same posts. The fact is that there are multiple options, but if you're going from a non-adjustable bridge saddle to an adjustable one, and you're using string gauges that are quite light, you may find that you're going to do better with an adjustable, and there are multiple options that you can get that will fit. Scott in Los Angeles says, I have a question. When a guitar comes your way and the seller claims this is the original hard shell case, how do you know this is true? The answer is that when Gibson, Fender, or Martin made a guitar, they didn't make the case, they ordered the cases from case makers such as Geib or Stone or Lifton, but whatever, or a case of Fender, Victoria or others, but the point is, these guitar companies didn't make their own cases. You can look at the case and tell if it is the right model case to go with that guitar, but it's not like, you know, a Les Paul with a certain serial number has a case that is specially matched for that guitar. They just picked one off the rack of the cases they had that were made by their supplier for that model. And typically also, for Martin, you could get a soft case, or you could get a sort of semi-hard case, or you could get a hard case with purple flannel interior lining, or you could get a more deluxe case that looked about the same on the outside but had nice green silk plush in it. And any one of those could be original to it. So I can't tell you if a guitar has its original case. I can only tell you if the case that's with it is the right model and maker and age for that guitar. And if a dealer gets in a guitar that comes in with the wrong case, and he has a case that's exactly the right type, it is still an original, period. The original maker, everything about it is absolutely right, and in no way would the guitar be devalued to have a case that didn't come from the music store with that guitar. It just has to have the right case for that model and that year. But otherwise, the answer is, how do you know? The answer is you don't, nor is it even important. I don't care if a guitar comes in with the case that it left the music store in or not, because some dealers even bought Martin guitars without a case and then put cases that they bought elsewhere for a little less money. Because before 1970, when Martin sold a guitar, it didn't have to come with a case. Today, they don't sell guitars without cases. You buy it, it comes with a case. But prior to 1970, that was typically not true. You could buy guitars from Martin, Gibson, or Fender, and you didn't have to get a case at all. But if you did get a case, you had options as to which case it would be. Today, the makers don't do that. If you buy a Martin, it's got the case that goes with that model. If you buy Gibson and Fender, it's pretty much the same thing. But George Scannell, when Eric Clapton was playing with Blind Faith in 1969, I noticed that during the live Hyde Park concert, he was playing a Telecaster with a Stratocaster neck. I know this is not too common. Do you think he just wanted to be cool and different, or was it to affect the sound? What real difference would that kind of combination make? Well, so far as playability and sound, it would have virtually no difference. But just as Eric had his tech mix and match parts for his Fender Stratocaster Blackie to get the neck that he liked the best, along with pickups that he liked the best. And they're built like an erector set. If you put a Strat neck on a Tele, it does fit, and you can play it, and the intonation will be the same, and the feel will basically be the same. The peg head shape is different, but is it going to be a notable difference in sound that you can tell with your eyes closed what's happening, or even feel with your eyes closed what's happening? If you're blind, you can touch the peg head and tell, but if you're playing with your eyes closed and you're not looking at the peg head, feeling it, frankly, you wouldn't know, and nobody listening to it's going to know either. It works. For TT, didn't give any other name other than two initials, collectors often don't play or display what they own. What would you say to that? Well, most players have some collectible instincts as well, but most collectors, it's rare to find a collector who doesn't play. I've encountered a few, but very, very few. Typically, they may not play all the guitars in their collection. If they're interested in historical instruments, they may have some that have great historical interest, but are not necessarily the best sounding or the best feel. Just like I have some guitars from the 1830s that I find are historically very interesting, but frankly, I have others that I'd much rather play. But I find nothing wrong with not playing every single guitar in my collection. The other thing I can say is that collectors in general take extremely good care of their instruments, whereas many, even professional musicians, really don't respect originality very much. And I'd rather see something that has great collectible appeal in the hands of a collector who doesn't play it than in the hands of a musician who will modify it irreversibly to make it suit him. I've seen things like some years ago, somebody came in with a Gibson Firebird 5 reverse body original, and they had removed the vibrato tailpiece and done a crude job of putting on a stop bar. Well, that might have suited him fine because it would stay in tune a bit better. And I said, well, why did you do that? Oh, I had to do it. I couldn't play it otherwise. Well, he cut the value of the guitar in half or more to do this. And he didn't really appreciate the guitar enough. The way he played, he could have sold that guitar and bought 3 other or 4 other guitars that would have suited him every bit as well and not destroyed an original valuable one to do it, because he really didn't have much appreciation for the guitar. So collectors put instruments in sometimes protective custody long enough that they become valuable enough that people then appreciate them enough to take good care of them. If it were not for collectors, there'd be no Stradivari or Guarneri violins left today. And if it were not for collectors, there'd be very few good vintage original instruments in truly fine, unaltered condition. Today, they're valuable enough that people who buy them take care of them. In fact, I remember one time seeing a Sunburst Les Paul, a 59 original, that would be worth well over $300,000 in good condition. And some idiot converted it to left-handed by taking a hacksaw and cutting a cutaway on the other side. And that may have made it suit him, but it sure didn't suit any collector. And they turned something that would have been worth $350,000 today into something that's worth a very small fraction of that now. It's important to respect instruments for what they are. I'm not saying don't play them, but at least understand what they are, treat them respectfully, take care of them with proper care. They can last literally hundreds of years. And if you abuse them, and you can convert it to something that might suit you for the moment, but you've irreversibly destroyed a piece of history and you've ruined its value. If you want something that plays differently and you don't appreciate the thing, find out what it's worth, get it appraised, and if it turns out that it's valuable, sell it and buy something you'd rather have, but don't hack up the original. Same person. I own a 1976 Les Paul Custom Gold Hardware Tobacco Finish. Bought it in Atlanta when I was a private in the Army. I'll not part with it. It weighs a lot. I'd like to go lighter with similar features. What would you suggest for a student of Eric Johnson pre-1970s? I'm open to suggestions, Strat, etc. Well, obviously Strat's not very equivalent, but if you want to sound like Eric Johnson on a Strat, you probably either get a pre-CBS or you can get one of the new Eric Johnson models, since he uses that. There's lots of options. And today, there are so many new Fenders made that are actually very stage-worthy that you get a new one or pre-CBS. But in general, my suggestions is either get something that's new, high-quality Fender, or else get one that's pre-CBS. But if you want a great sounding Fender, probably don't buy one from the 70s or 80s. Buy either a new one or pre-CBS. But the stuff that Fender, Gibson, Martin, Taylor, and numerous other makers are doing right now are very good guitars. So you have lots of options in addition to vintage. But leave the vintage ones in their original condition. TT also asks, why did you get into the business and what sets your approach to vintage instruments apart from the rest? Well, I can't claim that I'm going to be totally unique in every possible way, but basically this business is a hobby that got out of hand. And I found that for every one guitar I'd find in my obsession looking for guitars, I'd come across 20 or 30 that were great deals on things that I didn't want, but they were wonderfully cheap. And that's how I could afford to buy and keep the ones I did want. So as a natural byproduct of looking for vintage on a daily basis, I couldn't help but turn up lots of other things in my searches that were not exactly what I wanted, but were good deals. And I ended up finally getting a store open. But my background is in zoology. I look at these instruments as though they were living organisms. They fit in the Linnaean taxonomic order. I look at them the way a zoological or botanic taxonomist would, and I look at them the same way as my father, these forensic pathologists, would look at something. And before I buy one, it gets the complete forensic pathological exam. In some ways, that's different from anybody else in the business, but not totally. Other people can do a good job too. I'm not the only one in the world who could sell you a good vintage guitar and be reliable. But I'd like to think that I do a very good job at it. And we do have one of the only shops I know of that has a repair shop that has more people in repair than we have salespeople on the showroom floor. And we have fully as much floor space of repair as we have of retail showroom. Because a good salesperson can buy and sell multiple instruments in a day. But if you buy one that needs work, it may take an hour or even 5 minutes to buy one that might need 50 or 100 hours of repair. It creates a lot of work to service those instruments properly and to offer instruments that are guaranteed to be set up in good playing order with whatever restoration or setup needed. Restoration and setup are not one and the same thing. We spend fully half the time in the repair shop undoing previous botched repair work. But what we offer when we are selling a guitar is one that is set up and restored to the right standards. And restored does not mean if it has scratches to refinish it. We leave honest wear alone, but we want to keep it as close as possible to original correct specs and set up properly. And we do put a great deal of effort into that. Most stores, you can look at their floor plan, their repair department, if they have one at all, is about the size of one of our repair stalls. But we have 6,000 square feet of repair in this building. Um, Ian Francis, in your experience, do all 58 to 60 bursts have a chew mark in the control cavity? I have seen a number of examples of differing depths, which makes me think that some may not have one at all. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by a chew mark, so I'd appreciate if you send photos to george@guitars.com. But what I can say is that they didn't have CNC, computer numeric controlled routing, in those days. It was power equipment, but it was still hand guided. And sometimes we will see examples where there's some factory original work retouching a bit of the routing to get controls to fit exactly right, but generally not. So far as any special, really distinctive chew mark, in Fender guitars, you often see areas where it's almost a fuzzy wood bordering where they use a fairly rough router, and it wasn't smooth edged, but in the Gibson routing in there, generally it's pretty smooth and rather level on the inside of that cavity. So I'm going to have to say, no, they don't all have anything that I see as a visible chew mark, but the tooling of their cavities was very distinctive. And generally, we can look in there and have a high degree of confidence, whether it was done at the Gibson factory or whether something's been modified or is in fact a forgery. So the contouring of the control cavities is a critical factor when we are looking at a guitar to determine originality. Maury Sullivan in Lawrence, Kansas, could you please discuss your favorite or best acoustic bass guitar brands and models? I'd have to honestly say that most acoustic basses are not great sounding as acoustic bass guitars. I mean, upright bass, that's one thing, bass fiddle, but as far as acoustics that are shaped like a guitar, none of them have the power or tone of an upright bass. They just don't have a big enough body or a long enough scale to do that. And so basically what you're getting into is which one sounds the best with a pickup. And Tacoma used to make one that I liked quite well, but I helped design it, so I'm somewhat prejudiced on that. And at any rate, Tacoma's out of business, and there's not very many of those basses around. I'm not especially excited by any of the acoustic bass shape instruments or guitar shape, but with the right pickup, you can get a pretty decent sound. But so far as do any of them sound really fabulous acoustically, to put in a bluegrass band or any other band, will they cut, project well? I think the one word answer is no. Uh, for Jeffrey Bolek, what do you think of the work of Jean Larvae, acoustic guitars? My understanding is he was one of the first luthiers to try combining Martin's X bracing pattern with the fan bracing of nylon string guitars as hybrid bracing, uses an elongated X and tone bars running at about a 45-degree angle to produce a distinctive sound. Larvae is a very fine builder, and right now much of what he's doing is custom shop. Fancy guitars, often going to Japan and China these days. It's interesting enough now there are Chinese buyers who are starting to collect mostly new high-end guitars, not particularly vintage that I've seen. I have yet to sell my first guitar to a Chinese collector, but Jean tells me that much of his work he's showing even at the NAMM shows where his fancy ornamented ones is going to buyers in Japan and to China. And he does excellent work, especially on his high-end models. They're neat, clean. Uh, do I personally like them better than Martin's? The one-word answer is no. But do I think that they're good guitars? The answer is yes. So I have a personal leaning toward Martin. But Martin also is a vintage standard for acoustic flat tops, along with Gibson. But Gibson didn't do acoustic flat tops of any real merit until about 1929, so far as having, and those were actually copied from Martin body shapes and bracing patterns. So the Gibson L Series guitars, like the L00 and L1 and L2, and the Century Progress models have a body shape very similar to a 12 fret Martin 00. And their jumbos have a body shape that's somewhat modified from a Martin dreadnought body. They have a sloped shoulder, which is sort of like the Martin original 31 through 33 slope shoulder 12 fret Model D. But it's at any rate, they still have X bracing, very much copied after Martin. But Larvae still makes a fine guitar, and we carry some Larvaes here at the shop, and I have no problem recommending them as being good guitars. But most of the Larvaes we sell are in the lower price bracket, and they're very competitive in that range as well. But in the really high end, most of that is not, it's not in any catalog they do, but is custom order. As I said, a lot of that's going to Asia, but those guitars are good quality. Paul, what are your thoughts on the irreversible modification of vintage instruments to meet demand for more desirable models or simply to make them more saleable? The current trend for converting early Les Paul models to burst specs, i.e. routing for humbuckers, fitting a tune-o-matic bridge and stop tailpiece, refinishing in some cases veneering the maple top to hide an off-center seam or three-piece top springs to mind. An earlier example would be the conversion of Martin arch tops, specifically the F7 and F9 model. The market for Les Paul conversions has also led to other vintage Gibsons being cannibalized for their pickups, wiring, rigs, and other parts. It's sort of multiple questions in one, and I've already clearly stated that I detest having vintage instruments converted. And in general, these days, an original gold top Les Paul is worth more money left original than converted. So you're not really making it more saleable, you're not making it more valuable. But what has happened is that in order to get original PAF pickups, people rob them off of other guitars. So that they'll take them off of something like an ES 175 and put them on a Les Paul. And they may route up a Les Paul that was a gold top and put PAFs in it. And these days, even guitars like a 1959 ES 125D with double pickups has basically the same tone and volume knobs and the same wiring harness as a 59 Les Paul, but has different pickups. But it used to be people didn't bother much about the tone and volume pots until Hans Maust in the Netherlands published some information about pot codes, which then, when I did the Gruhn's Guide to Vintage Guitars, we put a page in about pot codes and how to date them. And all of a sudden, people wanted vintage pots. Before that, nobody talked about them and nobody cared, so people would replace tone and volume pots. If they got a bit scratchy or whatever, they just replace them. Now, they want those old ones, so now ES 125s, well, they're not bringing as much sometimes as you can get by cannibalizing it, robbing the tuners. And you can, by the time you take all the original parts off, the tuners, the tailpiece, the two P90 pickups, and the wiring harness, and the tone and volume knobs, and the switch tip, there are some people who will pay several $100s for the right switch tip if it's the exact same one as on a Les Paul. So you can take a 59 ES 125D and get more money for the parts than you can get for the pristine original one. Now, someday that may change, but frankly, it upsets me to see that done. But I do understand the financial incentive to do that. But when it comes down to converting a perfectly fine original gold top Les Paul from the 50s and trying to make a sunburst out of it, well, it still isn't going to be worth as much as an original burst unless you're going to try to make a forgery out of it and see if you can pass it off as original. But otherwise, no. And the forgery is dishonest. And if you're honestly representing it, you haven't increased its value, plus you destroyed something else in the process. So there's people who make a living selling parts. And if they're making a living by cannibalizing other guitars to do this, I don't approve. But as long as they can make a lot more money selling it stripped off, somebody's going to continue to do that. But it's a misguided thing to think that you're going to take that 50s Les Paul gold top and make it more valuable by putting PAFs in it. John Parsons, is there any sign that the early G&L guitars made when Leo was alive will ever become collectible like early Fenders? What is your opinion? The G&L is like the ASAT. They're very good guitars, but they have not shown any tendency to be sought by collectors who will pay particularly high prices. They are good utility guitars that have simply not really become highly collectible. I'm not holding my breath waiting for them to become anywhere near as valuable as early Fenders. Did I ever meet Leo Fender? If so, what was my impression of him? The only time I ever met him, he was old. He was suffering from Parkinson's. He didn't have much to say. About all I can say is he seemed to be a nice enough fellow, but I didn't know him well enough to personally have an opinion. For Mel Chapman, I have a Gibson Les Paul special tribute. Okay, well, with the 2020 with the ABR style bridge / tailpiece. But the one other thing I wanted to say to him, since we already discussed it, when you have any kind of bridge with a tune-o-matic, if it's not tuning well, it's probably one brand of tune-o-matic is not going to tune better, especially than another brand of tune-o-matic. It may sound better or be structurally easier to adjust, whatever, but if you have a tune-o-matic bridge and it's not tuning well, even when you adjust the intonation, check the nut slots. Because if there's any problems on the nut slots, you may find that the bearing edge of the string at the nut is not at the edge of the nut or in the correct place. And if you have nut slots that are messed up, your intonation, you can spend all day fidgeting at the bridge, you may never get it quite right. Dave Meyer on the Martin Guitar Facebook page is often a question about bridge pins, specifically the material used to make them. Some say cold steel are the best, others tusk or walrus ivory, bone, and plastic. Is there really much of a sonic difference in pins? Two Martins I still have whatever Martin shipped them with. I assume plastic, and lighten us, please. Well, the original Martins, with the exception of the style 45s, from the early 30s onward, had plastic bridge pins. They were ivoroid, but it was still a nitrocellulose. And on the style 18s, it was just plain black plastic. And some of the best sounding guitars I have ever heard from Martin have those original bridge pins. Martin has their new modern deluxe models, which they have metal bridge pins, what they're calling liquid metal. They're very heavy. Like they weigh about 10 times as much as the original standard plastic bridge pins. And they claim that it gives more volume and more sustain and better tone. And I've tried the modern deluxe with and without those pins that they come with, and I prefer them with regular plastic pins or wood pins. Ivory pins work just fine, but do I hear a big difference between ivory bridge pins versus the standard plastic pins? Not much. And do I like metal bridge pins? The answer is no, I don't. I think that they actually reduce volume and tone. And I feel that they are hype. But overall, bridge pins are not something that we change on original guitars, nor do I notice a difference in tone that is noticeable. John Chamberlain in Richmond, Virginia, considering all the guitar brands being produced today and with manufacturers continuing to proliferate their product lines, do you think the market is becoming saturated? If so, would you expect to see some price erosion occur? Well, I think that the market may well be saturated with guitars. Certainly Martin and Taylor and Collings are making way more guitars than they used to. It took Martin from the 1830s through 1947 to hit serial number 100,000. They're consecutively numbered. Today they make more than 100,000 in a year. They didn't hit serial number 200,000 until about 1965. But now, as I said, they're making not quite 200,000 in a year, but they're making more than 100,000 in a year. And Taylor started in 74. They made way more than they used to. And Gibson is still trying to ramp up production. So right now, Gibson is in a state of transition with new management. We'll have to see what they do in production, but Gibson's acoustic production is nowhere near as much right now in the USA as either Taylor or Martin. But the point is, there's a heck of a lot of guitars, and with good care, a guitar can last a long time. I have an 1842 Martin right now that plays great. I'm not expecting everybody's guitar to last that long, but if you take care of them, there's no reason why a guitar should not last long enough that your great-great-grandchildren could play the same guitar if you take good care of it. The market can get saturated, but it's not saturated with guitars that are better than the Golden Era originals. Those are finite in number, and value is what the quality is of guitars in the future. I can't tell you 50 years what's going to be done. For one thing, I won't even be around 50 years from now because I'll be 75 in August. But the quality of new guitars is better now than it has been in a long time. And there are times I seriously wonder where they're all going to go. But so far, they've been able to keep it up. And market trends, demographic shift is such that we don't know what a lot of people will want in the near future. You don't use a lot of guitars in rap or hip hop, although there's a little bit of it. We'll see. But the guitar is not going away. And I don't think that they're all just going to be, they're not going to lose value. Question, Tim in Sydney, Australia. I have a daughter who lives in Sydney. Says, I'm a collector. I'm an okay guitar player, but I love everything about my vintage guitar collection. I love reading about the history, the stories about the golden years, but I'm genuinely concerned about valuations. With Fender, Gibson, and Martin making such great instruments in the modern era, I don't think future generations are going to treasure the golden era vintage instruments like you and I do. What do you think? And I think, again, that's a similar question. But are they making better ones right now than the true golden era? The one word answer, in my opinion, is no. Martin makes some really good guitars right now, but do they sound better than a 1937 D18 or a 0018 or a good 1930s, early 30s, 29 through 33 OM Martin? No, they don't. Those things are magically good. And the best, the new ones approach that, but they don't beat it. And the originals have value. Stradivari and Guarneri violins to this day are more valuable than ever. Good Strads and good Guarneris can push well over $10 million for an instrument. And there are some fine new violins. In fact, there are some people who claim that in blind tests that the audience can't tell the difference. But I think in general, the player can tell the difference. It's just like watching somebody drive a Ferrari. You don't know exactly what his performance is versus that. Maybe you compare a Ferrari and a M Series, BMW and Lamborghini, whatever. But if you're driving down the interstate and you see somebody in a Ferrari in the next lane over and he's doing the speed limit, even if he passes you, you don't know what that thing feels like. The only one who knows what those feel like is the guy behind the wheel. Even if you're in a sedan and you're in the passenger seat, you do not know what that thing feels like. You can't tell it feels alive and just how responsive it really is. But with the guitar, you can try all the tricks and nobody gets hurt. Whereas if you're driving a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or whatever, an M Series BMW, and you don't know enough about how to do it, it may give you suggestions as things you'd like to try. And if you lose control because you're not adept enough or you misjudge, you could be dead. You might take out some other people that you hit with you. Richard H. Buse. Is there still a market for original Mosrite guitars? I see them for sale at fairly high prices, but they don't seem to sell. Well, I don't know which model it is that you're talking about, but if it's Venture's Mosrite models, those bring money. But there was a period when they were actually bringing more than they are today. I think there may not be quite as many Ventures fans, particularly the Ventures had a lot following in Japan. And the price was determined more by what they brought in Tokyo than what they were bringing here. But the early Ventures models with the Vibramute tailpiece and the glue-in rather than bolt-on neck were bringing serious money, and they still bring good money today. I would think that one of those would probably bring at least $6,000. But some people just aren't realistic in asking prices. And I'm not sure how much you've seen them being offered at, but in general, the ones that really bring the big money are few and far between. They're quite rare. The later Ventures models don't bring, especially, they may bring $3,500 or so, but they're not bringing pre-CBS Fender prices. But there were people in Japan in particular back in the 80s and even in the late 70s who were very sophisticated collectors of Ventures guitars. But the problem with a lot of those guys is that if they're close to my age that they were then, and some of them were even a bit older than I was, I'll be 75 in August, and most people after age 65 are not in what I call the active acquisition phase of their life cycle. If they had a midlife crisis and they bought 50 or 100 or more guitars when they were 40 to 50 years old, unlike a car that wears out, those guitars don't wear out. They can last hundreds of years if you take care of them. So now these people have their collections, but they may be downsizing, moving to a smaller place, or they may die, or they become too arthritic to play, or they get Alzheimer's. And one way or other, their executors or family may be selling those instruments. And I don't see as many young players in their 40s, say. To me, that's young. I'm 75 almost. But do today's millennials look especially for Mosrite Ventures models? I think probably not as much as my generation did. And so we'll see. But the fact is, original early Mosrites, particularly Ventures models, do still have significant value. Ted Silverman, despite the general assumption that Japanese guitars from makers like Ibanez, Alvarez, Yamaha, and others are less attractive to American collectors, can you please speak to the quality on the high end and playability of many of these instruments? Well, in general, on the high end, there are some Japanese guitars. Starting in the mid-70s, some of the Japanese makers were producing instruments that were made very specifically for the Japanese domestic home market rather than for export, because they were expensive enough that even by the mid-70s, land in Japan cost more than here. Raw materials cost more than here. They weren't cutting their own forests. They didn't have much of it. Their few forests were national treasures, which they didn't do. They didn't want to cut that. They cut other people's forests elsewhere. The quality of those is very good, and some of those now bring pretty good prices, but they're not better than vintage, original, old golden era American instruments. But there are some Japanese guitars of the late 70s and early 80s that when it comes right down to it are fully as good as the Fender and Gibson Electrics of the same age. They're not better than the golden era Fenders or Gibsons, but they gave Gibson a real run for the money for a while. And so some of those actually are plenty good. And then Yamaha made some acoustic guitars that were custom shop, special high-end models similar to what John Denver had. And they were quite expensive. They are good. So that's something that is worthy of consideration. The Japanese guitars are not junk. The ones they made in the 60s typically were low quality. But certainly by 74, when I went to Japan, I saw guitars there that were on display, but there was nothing like them sold in the US, but they were for the domestic market. They were good quality instruments. And today, Japanese labor costs every bit as much as American labor, and everything else over there costs more. So you don't see a whole lot of new Japanese-made guitars here, but the few that you do see that are made in Japan are good quality. Don Sarlin, how do you feel about the high-end guitars with bolts holding the necks on Collings Bourgeois? Is there any negative impact on tone to this? Well, I personally prefer a dovetail, but the fact is that it's absolutely possible to make a good sounding guitar with a bolt on. And it certainly is easier to do a neck set adjustment later if necessary, if it is a bolt on. Taylor has their own system that is not simply a bolt on, but it is their own special system, and it's very well engineered. There's more than one good way to put in a neck. And I think that when it comes right down to it, there are so many other variables that nobody makes a guitar that is identical to one with the dovetail, except for the neck joint. So if you're comparing a Collings to a Martin, they may exteriorly look similar, but their manufacturing techniques are quite different. And Collings has a tone of its own. Martin has its own tone. Bourgeois has his own tone. And there's too many variables here. You're not just changing one thing. So can I just say that you can make a good guitar either way, but each of these makers has a distinctive character of their own, and judge the whole guitar. And there's no question that the makers you named are producing fine quality guitars. And yes, it can be done with a bolt-on neck. The last question I've got for today, Tony Maddox. Many early PRS guitars have never really grown in value despite being excellent instruments. Any thoughts on why, and are there any early PRS models that stand out? Well, in general, the ones made in their very first year, 1965, and on into 66, but particularly the 65 models, which was their first year. I was there at the New Orleans trade show, the NAMM show, that summer show where the PRS was first introduced. I still remember that booth very well. They got a lot of attention. And at that time, it was 1985, if I said something different, it was 85, 1985 was their first year. And those guitars bring serious money. A few years later, they don't bring near as much. They still hold their value okay, but the ones that PRS that bring the most money are that very first year, perhaps into 1986 or 85 and 86. One factor there is that, frankly, the brand new PRS guitars are extremely good, so that the vintage models of the late 80s do not put the new one to shame. And as long as the new one is every bit as good or better, what you're getting down to is there's a collector's item appeal about having the first year of issue. And beyond that, PRS is going to sell mostly for its utilitarian appeal as very good guitars. I'll look forward to next week when we'll have more questions from our listeners. And keep in mind that Gruhn Guitars is open by appointment, but appointments are real easy to get. Nobody who calls and asks for an appointment has been turned down. And at this point, nobody who comes to the door without an appointment and rings the bell is going to be left waiting very long. You're not going to be told to come back tomorrow. If you want to come and visit, we're here. We're ready to help you by phone, by email, online orders, or in person. We are here and look forward to seeing you.